Pay attention to this security camera footage. February 12, 2013, Blackwood Manor, upstate New York. Residential CCTV mounted on the stone patio captures exactly 31 seconds. You see an elderly man with thinning white hair sitting in a wheelchair, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. A woman, 29 years old, wearing a modest caregiver's uniform and a cardigan, walks from the French doors toward him. She bends down. She tucks the blanket around his legs against the biting winter wind. Then, she places her hand on the armrest and she kisses him on the mouth. Tender, real, for 4 seconds. It isn't the kiss of an employee. It is a promise. Then she straightens up, smiles, moves behind the wheelchair, and pushes him back toward the house. At 6:35 p.m., they disappear from the camera's view. This is the last time Elena Rossi is seen alive. 13 days later, February 25, 2013, 8:14 a.m. Anonymous call to the county dispatch center. Male voice distorted, mechanically calm. Riverside Warehouse, Unit 4B, there's a body. Line goes dead. Detectives arrive. The warehouse district is a graveyard of industry, abandoned for years. They force open Unit 4B, a rusted rolling door secured by a shiny brand new padlock. Inside, in the freezing dark, they find Elena Rossi, hands zip-tied behind her back, coarse ligature marks around her neck, still wearing the cardigan and uniform from 13 days ago. She'd been dead for nearly 2 weeks, while Arthur Blackwood sat at a table set for 2, waiting for her. Now, most people think this is about a robbery gone wrong or a predator on the mountain roads. Wrong. This is about $10 million, a handwritten will, and a family that decided an inheritance was worth more than a human life. 2011, 2 years prior. Arthur Blackwood, 79 years old, a real estate tycoon, suffers a massive stroke. He survives, but he is paralyzed from the waist down, his speech slurred, his dominance over his empire shattered. Arthur has 2 children. Son Richard, 50, a gambler, with mounting debts. Daughter Sarah, 48, a socialite living beyond her means. First month after the stroke, they visit, they check the accounts, they speak to the doctors. Second month, visits slow. By the 6-month mark, almost nothing. Richard visits when he needs a loan. Sarah visits on holidays for appearances. Arthur spends his 80th birthday alone in a 20-room mansion, staring at a grand piano he can no longer play. Investigators later recover his journal from late 2012. My children look at me and see an ATM that is taking too long to dispense the cash. They are waiting for me to die. January 2012. The family hires a new caregiver. They want someone cheap, someone quiet. They hire Elena Rossi, 28 years old, an immigrant working 3 jobs to pay off nursing school debts. She arrives at Blackwood Manor. She finds a man who has given up. He sits in his wheelchair by the window, bitter, silent. Elena doesn't treat him like furniture. She notices the dust on the piano. She asks, "Mr. Blackwood, do you miss the music?" Arthur doesn't answer. The next day, Elena brings sheet music. She can't play well, but she tries. She plays a clumsy version of Chopin. Arthur winces. Then, for the first time in a year, he speaks. "F sharp. You missed the F sharp." Elena laughs. She asks him to teach her. Over the next year, Elena does more than required. She becomes his hands. She reads to him. She drives him to the cliffs overlooking the ocean, places where he feels small but free. Arthur starts smiling. The bitterness fades. He starts writing again, training his left hand. By early 2013, the dynamic has shifted. Richard and Sarah are too busy to notice. They don't see the way Arthur looks at Elena. They don't see the way Elena looks at him, not with pity, but with admiration. They don't know that on February 10, 2013, Arthur called his lawyer to draft a new will. They don't know that the 6:34 p.m. kiss on the patio wasn't just affection. It was a seal on a pact to start a new life together. But walls have ears in old houses, and Richard Blackwood was desperate for money. To understand why a 29-year-old nurse ended up dead in a frozen warehouse, you have to understand the silence of Blackwood Manor 2 years prior. June 14, 2011. The day the music stopped. Arthur Blackwood, a man who built skyscrapers and reshaped the city skyline, was attending a charity gala at the Met. At 8:42 p.m., while holding a glass of champagne, his speech slurred. His left side collapsed, a massive ischemic stroke. In seconds, the titan of industry became a patient. He survived, but the Arthur Blackwood who woke up in the ICU was not the man who fell. He was paralyzed from the waist down, his left arm useless, his voice reduced to a raspy, labored whisper. The doctors called it a new baseline. His children called it an inconvenience. Meet the family. Richard Blackwood, 50, a man who wore Italian suits but carried the desperate sweat of a gambler. Casino records from Atlantic City show that while his father was in neuro ICU, Richard was at a blackjack table, down $40,000, checking his phone not for medical updates, but for wire transfers. Then there is Sarah, 48, a socialite whose calendar was fuller than her heart. During the first month of Arthur's recovery, hospital logs show she visited 3 times. Total duration, 45 minutes. She spent most of that time arguing with the doctors about the cost of the private room. They looked at their father and didn't see a parent. They saw a vault that had suddenly locked itself. They needed power of attorney. They needed access. But Arthur, despite his broken body, had a mind that was still sharp, still watching. He refused to sign control over to them, so they punished him with isolation. By late 2011, Arthur was sent home. Not to a home, but to a prison of velvet and mahogany. The visits stopped. Richard was busy dodging loan sharks. Sarah was busy wintering in Aspen. They fired the expensive round-the-clock medical team to save money. He doesn't need experts, Richard told the estate manager. He just needs a babysitter. This is the crucial mistake. In their greed, in their desire to cut costs, they created the vacancy that Elena Rossi would fill. January 2012. Elena answers an ad for a live-in caregiver, minimal experience required. She was an immigrant, drowning in student loans from a nursing degree she couldn't afford to finish. She needed the job. Richard hired her because she was cheap. He didn't know he was hiring the only person who would actually care. When Elena arrived at Blackwood Manor, she found a ghost. Arthur spent his days in a wheelchair facing the window, his back to the room. The house was silent. Dust motes danced in the light, settling on the furniture like snow. The most tragic object in the house was in the grand ballroom, a Steinway Model D concert grand piano. Arthur had played since he was 5. It was his voice, his soul. Now it sat under a heavy tarp, ignored, much like its owner. For the first 3 weeks, Arthur didn't speak to Elena. He grunted commands, water, pills, sleep. He was waiting to die. He assumed she was like the others there to keep him alive but not living. But Elena was different. She didn't just dust around the objects. She looked at them. One Tuesday in March 2012, she did something unauthorized. She walked into the ballroom and pulled the tarp off the Steinway. The sound of the heavy fabric hitting the floor made Arthur turn his wheelchair around. He watched, eyes narrowing, expecting her to clean it. She didn't. She sat down on the bench. Elena Rossi didn't know Chopin from Beethoven. She knew simple folk songs from her childhood. She placed her fingers on the keys and played a clumsy, hesitant melody. It was out of tempo. She missed notes. To a trained ear like Arthur's, it should have been torture. Arthur rolled his chair closer. For the first time in 6 months, his eyes had a spark. He cleared his throat. "Wrong," he rasped. It was the first word he had spoken to her in days. Elena stopped, hands hovering over the keys. She turned, terrified she would be fired. "Sir?" Arthur wheeled himself right up to the treble side of the keyboard. His left hand was dead, but his right hand trembled as he lifted it. He couldn't play. His dexterity was gone, but he could point. "It's a G-sharp," he whispered, his voice cracking with disuse. You are missing the G-sharp." Elena looked at him, then at the keys. She played the G-sharp. The chord resolved. It sounded right. She smiled at him. "Like this?" That afternoon changed the trajectory of the next year. It became their ritual, the piano sessions. Richard and Sarah thought Elena was just earning her paycheck. They didn't know that inside the manor, a partnership was forming. Elena became Arthur's hands. he taught her to read music. He would sit beside her, humming the melody in his broken voice, tapping the rhythm on the arm of his wheelchair while she struggled to translate his soul onto the keys. They spent hours like this. The silence of the manor was replaced by music halting at first, then fluid. Through the music, Arthur shared his past. Through her listening, Elena shared her dreams. They weren't patient and nurse anymore. They were teacher and student, survivors in a lonely house. The family thought they had isolated Arthur to break him. Instead, by leaving him alone with Elena, they had accidentally given him a reason to live. By January 2013, the atmosphere inside Blackwood Manor had shifted from a mausoleum to something resembling a home, though the change was invisible to the outside world. The catalyst for this transformation was not a grand medical breakthrough, but a silver spoon. For months, Arthur Blackwood had been waging a silent, grueling war against his own atrophy. While Richard and Sarah were busy speculating on how long the old man had left, Arthur was in the converted gym on the first floor, sweating through agonizing physical therapy sessions. He wasn't trying to walk. He knew those days were gone. He was fighting for his right hand. He wanted the tremor to stop just enough to hold a utensil. He refused to let Elena feed him like an infant any longer. He wanted to dine with her, not be serviced by her. The breakthrough came on a snowy Tuesday evening in mid-January. Dinner was served in the small library, a more intimate setting than the cavernous dining hall. Elena placed a bowl of soup in front of him and sat opposite with her own meal, a breach of protocol that the other household staff whispered about in the kitchen. "The nurse thinks she's the lady of the house," the cook had sneered to the maid. They saw a young immigrant woman and a wealthy old man and assumed the worst. They assumed manipulation. They assumed a tawdry affair. They were wrong. What was happening in the library was a restoration of dignity. Arthur picked up his spoon. His hand shook, the silver clinking against the china, but he steadied it. He lifted the soup to his lips, swallowed, and looked at Elena. She didn't clap or patronize him. She simply smiled, raised her own glass of water in a silent toast, and continued eating. In that silence, there was a profound respect that Arthur hadn't felt from his own blood in decades. It was this specific moment, the dignity of a shared meal, that crystallized Arthur's resolve. He looked at Elena, saw the dark circles under her eyes from working double shifts to pay her debts, saw the coat she had stitched and restitched, and he made a decision. He realized that the millions sitting in his trust funds were currently destined for two people who wished him dead, while the woman keeping him alive was struggling to buy gas. The injustice of it burned him. The next morning, Arthur made a phone call. He didn't call the family firm's attorney who played golf with Richard. He called Henry Vance, a retired estate lawyer and an old rival he respected for his absolute discretion. Vance arrived on January 20th, under the guise of an old friend paying a visit. Elena let him in, served them tea, and then discreetly withdrew to the garden to give them privacy, unaware that she was the subject of the meeting. In the dim light of the study, Arthur laid out his instructions with a clarity that stunned Vance. "I want a new will," Arthur rasped, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "Cut them out. Richard, Sarah, all of it." Vance hesitated, warning Arthur about the inevitable legal firestorm. He spoke of undue influence, and how the courts would view a dying tycoon leaving everything to a young nurse. Arthur cut him off. "She isn't influencing me, Henry. She is the only reason I am lucid enough to have this conversation." The terms were drafted right there. 80% of the liquid assets, roughly $10 million, would go into a trust for Elena Rossi. The Blackwood Charitable Foundation, currently mismanaged by Sarah as a vanity project, would be transferred to Elena's control. The remaining assets would be liquidated and donated to stroke rehabilitation research. Arthur dictated every clause with vindictive precision. He wanted to ensure that when he died, Elena wouldn't just be rich, she would be powerful. She would have the freedom to finish her nursing degree, to travel, to live without the crushing weight of poverty. He imagined the look on Richard's face when the will was read, but more importantly, he imagined the look on Elena's face when she realized she was safe. The draft was finalized on January 28th. Vance promised to return with the official, notarized copies for signing on Valentine's Day, February 14th, a date Arthur chose deliberately because he wanted to give it to Elena as a gift, the ultimate thank you. For the rest of January, Arthur lived with a secret buoyancy. He watched Elena move through the house, oblivious to the fact that she was effectively a multimillionaire in waiting. He didn't say a word to her about the money. He wanted no transaction to taint the purity of their time together. He simply worked harder at his therapy, sat taller in his chair, and allowed himself to believe that he had finally outsmarted his greedy children. He didn't know that in his haste to secure her future, he had painted a target on her back. The walls of Blackwood Manor were thick, built from stone and oak meant to withstand centuries of storms, but Richard Blackwood knew that even the thickest walls had cracks if you knew where to look. By the first week of February 2013, Richard was a man drowning on dry land. His gambling debts had metastasized from a manageable problem into a lethal threat. He owed 6 figures to a syndicate in Atlantic City that didn't accept payment plans, only cash or bone. He had visited the manor 3 times that week, not to see his father, but to sniff around, sensing the change in the atmosphere. He had seen the lawyer, Henry Vance, leaving the estate in late January. He had seen the way the staff whispered. Paranoia, fueled by the imminent threat of physical violence from his creditors, drove him to do something desperate. On February 2nd, during a brief moment when Elena was in the kitchen and Arthur was resting, Richard slipped into his father's study. He didn't look for papers. He knew Arthur kept the safe locked instead. He slid a small, voice-activated digital recorder behind a row of leather-bound encyclopedias on the bookshelf nearest the desk. It was a crude piece of espionage, bought at an electronics store for $40, but it was enough to catch the echoes of a dynasty collapsing. 3 days later, Richard returned to retrieve the device. He sat in his luxury sedan parked a mile down the road, plugging the recorder into his auxiliary jack. For 20 minutes he heard nothing but the scratching of a pen and the hum of the heater. Then he heard it. The voice of Henry Vance, clear and professional. "I have the draft ready, Arthur. We are set for the signing on the 15th. Once you sign this, the previous will is void. Richard and Sarah get nothing. Elena gets the trust. $10 million. Richard froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him cold in the heated car. He rewound the track, played it again. $10 million. February 15th. He looked at the dashboard clock. It was February 5th. He had 10 days. 10 days before he went from being the heir apparent to a pauper with a target on his back. The realization wasn't just financial, it was existential. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, screaming in a silent rage that the glass insulated from the world. He didn't see his father's decision as an act of charity. He saw it as a theft. In his twisted logic, that money was already his. Elena Rossi wasn't just a nurse. She was a thief who had seduced a senile old man. He called Sarah immediately. They didn't meet at the manor. The walls were now the enemy. They met at a roadside diner off the interstate, a place where people like the Blackwoods would never be seen. Sarah arrived looking impeccable in cashmere, but her hands were shaking as she held her coffee. Richard played the recording for her. When the lawyer's voice mentioned Richard and Sarah get nothing, Sarah's face hardened into a mask of pure venom. "She did this," Sarah hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "That little immigrant witch. She worked her way in, and now she's taking everything." They spent an hour debating options. Could they have Arthur declared incompetent? No, Vance had already anticipated that. The recording mentioned a psychological evaluation Arthur had passed with flying colors. Could they fire her? No, Arthur would just rehire her or sign the will anyway. The problem wasn't the job. The problem was the person. As long as Elena Rossi was alive and breathing on February 15th, the money was gone. The conclusion hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken, until Richard finally whispered it. "She can't be there on the 15th, Sarah. She can't be anywhere." While his children were plotting murder over lukewarm coffee, Arthur Blackwood was sitting in his study, unaware that his private sanctuary had been violated. He was on the phone, but not with a lawyer. He was speaking to a jeweler in the city, an old artisan who had crafted pieces for Arthur's late wife decades ago. Arthur held a catalog in his trembling hand, pointing at a design he couldn't wait to see in person. Yes, the pearl, Arthur said, his voice soft with affection. Not a diamond. Diamonds are cold. I want the pearl brooch, the one shaped like a lily. He planned to give it to Elena on February 14th, Valentine's Day. It wasn't a romantic declaration in the traditional sense, but a symbol of purity and gratitude. He wanted to pin it to her cardigan before he signed the papers the next day, a small token to go with the massive fortune he was about to bestow upon her. The tragedy of the moment was absolute. Arthur sat in the winter sunlight, smiling as he imagined Elena's surprise, picturing how the creamy white of the pearl would look against her navy uniform. He believed he was preparing for a celebration of a new future. He had no idea that mere miles away, his son and daughter were deciding that Elena would never live to see the 14th, let alone the 15th. The brooch would eventually be delivered to the house on Valentine's Day, arriving in a velvet box tied with a satin ribbon, but by the time the courier rang the doorbell, the house would be empty of music, and the woman it was intended for would be lying in the freezing dark of room 4B. The tail lights of Elena Rossi's 2004 Ford Taurus faded into the darkness at exactly 6:40 p.m., swallowed by the winding service road that snaked down from the Blackwood estate. Inside the car, the heater rattled, fighting a losing battle against the February chill, but Elena didn't mind. She was humming a melody, the very G-sharp major chord progression Arthur had taught her earlier that afternoon. On the passenger seat beside her lay a stack of nursing textbooks and a list of groceries she planned to buy for tomorrow's Valentine's lunch. She was thinking about the salmon Arthur liked, wondering if the local market would have fresh dill. She was thinking about the future. She had no idea that she had already run out of time. 2 miles down the mountain, where the road curves sharply near the old drainage spillway, a black pickup truck sat idling with its lights off. Inside were 2 men, hired not from a professional agency, but from the shadow of the city's shipping docks men Richard Blackwood had found through a gambling associate. They weren't master assassins. They were blunt instruments, hired for a flat fee to clean up a mess. At 6:48 p.m., as Elena's headlights swept across the trees, the pickup truck surged forward, blocking the narrow lane. Elena slammed on her brakes. The tires skidded on the black ice, coming to a halt inches from the truck's bumper. Before she could reach for her phone, the doors of the truck flew open. The violence was swift and overwhelming. There was the sound of shattering glass, a scream cut short by a heavy gloved hand, and the terrified realization that this was not a robbery. They didn't ask for her purse. They dragged her from the safety of her car and threw her into the back of the van that had pulled up behind her. A vehicle Richard had insured was untraceable. The drive to the Riverside district took 30 minutes. Elena Rossi spent those final minutes in the dark, zip-tied and gagged, listening to the tires hum against the asphalt. The van eventually slowed, turning onto the gravel path of the derelict industrial park. They stopped in front of Unit 4B. This location was chosen with cruel irony. It was a property Richard had technically managed for the family company, a dead asset he had failed to sell for years. Now it would serve a final, gruesome purpose. They dragged her inside. The air in the warehouse was colder than the night outside, smelling of rust and stagnation. They brought her to the back room. At 8 p.m., under the flickering light of a single battery-powered lantern, the contract was fulfilled. One of the men tightened a length of rope around her neck. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't painless. Elena Rossi died terrified, alone in a concrete box, punished simply for showing kindness to a man his own family had discarded. Meanwhile, high on the hill at Blackwood Manor, the silence was deafening. Arthur Blackwood sat in his wheelchair by the library window, a book open but unread on his lap. It was his ritual. Every night, after Elena got home, usually around 7:30 p.m., she would call the landline in his study. It was a short call, never more than a minute. "I'm home safe, Arthur. Sleep well. See you in the morning." It was the tether that allowed him to sleep. Tonight, the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 7:30. The phone sat silent on the mahogany desk. Arthur stared at it. He told himself she was stopping for gas. He told himself traffic was bad. 7:45 p.m. The silence stretched. Arthur wheeled himself over to the desk. He reached for the handset to call her mobile, but his hand hovered over the receiver. He didn't want to seem overbearing. He waited. 8 p.m. At the exact moment Elena took her last breath in the warehouse, Arthur felt a sudden sharp coldness wash over him. It wasn't a draft. It was a severance. A visceral, sickening feeling in his gut that whispered, "She is gone." He picked up the phone and dialed her number with his trembling fingers. It rang, and rang, and rang. Then, voicemail. "Hi, this is Elena. Leave a message." Her voice, bright and alive, filled the empty room. Arthur slammed the phone down. He dialed again. Voicemail. By 9 p.m., the panic had mutated into a deep, heavy grief. He knew. He didn't know the details. He didn't know about the van or the warehouse or the rope, but he knew she wasn't coming back. The house, which had been filled with music and warmth for the last year, suddenly felt like a tomb again. He sat there in the dark, the unlit pearl brooch hidden in his drawer upstairs, realizing that the tomorrow she had promised him on the patio was a lie. He stayed by the phone all night, wide awake, listening to the wind howl, waiting for a ring that would never come, while miles away, Richard Blackwood received a simple text message on a burner phone. Done. The unraveling of the Blackwood dynasty did not happen with the explosive drama of a movie climax, but with the cold, bureaucratic precision of a forensic audit. The detectives who stood over Elena Rossi's body in Unit 4B on February 25th had one crucial lead: the warehouse itself. It wasn't just a random abandoned building, it was a commercial property with a paper trail. By March 2, 2013, investigators had pierced the corporate veil of the shell company listed on the deed, Apex Holdings, and found the name of its sole beneficiary, Richard Blackwood. Richard had been arrogant, or perhaps just desperate, using a property he already controlled to hide the body, believing the police would never look closely at a dusty, unsold asset on the edge of town. He was wrong. The connection gave the police probable cause to subpoena phone records, which revealed the flurry of frantic calls between Richard, Sarah, and the two hired thugs on the night of February 12th. The text message, "Done," found on Richard's burner phone was the final nail in the coffin. On March 5, 2013, the illusion of the Blackwood family's immunity shattered. Richard was arrested at a high-stakes poker table in Atlantic City, handcuffed face down on the green felt, while the casino security cameras rolled, a fitting end for a gambler who finally bet more than he could cover. Sarah was arrested hours later at a charity brunch, dragged out in front of the very social circle she had killed to impress. Both were charged with conspiracy to commit capital murder. The trial preparation revealed the full, sickening scope of their motive: the wiretaps, the fear of the new will, the desperation to secure the $10 million before Valentine's Day. They had acted to stop their father from signing away their inheritance, believing that with Elena gone, Arthur would have no choice but to leave the money to his blood relatives. They assumed the old will, the one drafted years ago naming them as sole beneficiaries, would stand by default. But fate and the law had a final, devastating irony in store. While his children sat in holding cells denying their crimes, Arthur Blackwood was dying. The grief of losing Elena had done what the stroke could not. It broke his will to endure. He stopped eating. He stopped the physical therapy that had given him the strength to lift a spoon. He sat in the library staring at the unlit fireplace, clutching the velvet box containing the pearl lily brooch he had never given her. He withered away in that massive, silent house, surrounded by wealth that now felt like ash. On April 14th, 2013, exactly 2 months after the Valentine's Day, that never happened, Arthur Blackwood passed away in his sleep. His heart simply stopped beating, exhausted by the weight of sorrow. With Arthur dead and the new will unsigned, Richard and Sarah, even from their prison cells, smirked. They believed they had won the war, even if they had lost their freedom. They reasoned that the money would pay for high-end defense attorneys and appeals. However, the district attorney invoked the Slayer Rule, a legal doctrine preventing a person from inheriting property from a decedent if they were responsible for the death of that person. While they hadn't killed Arthur directly, The court ruled that their murder of Elena Rossi was an act committed specifically to interfere with Arthur's testamentary intent and defraud the estate. The judge declared them unworthy heirs, effectively treating them as if they had predeceased their father. This legal ruling led to the ultimate collapse of the Blackwood legacy. Since the new will giving the money to Elena was never signed and she was deceased regardless, and the old will's beneficiaries, Richard and Sarah, were legally disqualified, Arthur Blackwood died intestate with no eligible heirs. Under state law, the entire estate, the mansion, the trust funds, the $10 million, the investments, is cheated to the state. The fortune they had killed for was seized by the government. The mansion was eventually sold at auction to pay for victim services and state welfare programs. The proceeds were fractured into 1,000 bureaucratic budgets, feeding the very social safety nets Richard had despised. The Blackwood name, once carved into the city's skyline, ended in absolute disgrace. Richard and Sarah were sentenced to life without parole in 2014. They spend their days in concrete cells, infinitely smaller than the manor they grew up in, knowing that their greed bought them nothing but a cage, and that the fortune they destroyed 2 lives to protect no longer exists. The Blackwood case closed in 2014. Richard and Sarah are in prison for life. Arthur is dead. Elena is dead. But the questions remain. How many other families have conspired to eliminate caregivers they saw as threats to their inheritance? How many other desperate men are waiting in pickup trucks for the next paycheck? We do not know. Most criminals will not be as careless as the Blackwoods. Most will get away with it. Elena's last moment of freedom was 6:34 p.m. February 12th, kissing Arthur on a patio while a camera recorded and killers waited 2 miles away. She had 6 minutes left before she drove into the dark. If she had known, would she have done anything different? Would she have called the police, or held on to Arthur a little longer? We will never know. But we know this. She deserved better. Arthur deserved better. If you work in healthcare, vary your routines. Do not drive home the same way every night. Do not park in dark spots. Do not assume wealthy families are safe families. Document every hostile look, every accusation, every threat. Trust your instincts. If you feel watched, report it. Create a paper trail. Elena thought love was enough to protect her. It was not. If this story touched you, please share it to warn others and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. May God bless you and keep you and your family safe from the evil that hides in plain sight. Please drop an amen in the comments to pray for Elena and Arthur and for the safety of every caregiver working tonight.